The dark beginning London, 1600. The city was wrapped in fog, its streets slick with rain, its taverns alive with whispers. Merchants and nobles huddled together in smoky halls, their eyes glittering not with warmth, but with hunger for power, wealth, and dominion. That night, a decision was being made that would ripple through centuries, staining the world with both gold and blood. And as the fire crackled in the hearth, shadows danced on the walls, almost as if mocking the men who believed they were birthing only opportunity. Little did they know, what they created would grow into one of the most ruthless machines in human history. The East India Company was born in secrecy, its charter signed with ink that might as well have been mixed with blood. To the common man, it was just another trading venture. To kings and queens, it was a promise of riches beyond imagination. But to the millions who would come under its shadow, it would mean famine, war, and chains. This wasn't a company, it was an empire within an empire, a beast with endless appetites, and its reach would extend far beyond spices and silks. Every decision made in those candle-lit chambers would leave scars that generations would never heal. The first ships set sail eastward, with sails like wings of vultures, cutting through the mist of the Thames and disappearing into the horizon. To those watching from the docks, it looked like progress, like adventure. But if you looked closely into the eyes of the captains and investors, you'd see something else. Greed sharpened to a blade. For them, lands thousands of miles away weren't homes to thriving civilizations. They were maps to be carved, resources to be seized, people to be broken. Every wave that carried those ships forward was already whispering of plunder and conquest. In India, the air was heavy with spices, colors, and centuries of tradition. Kingdoms ruled with pride. Poets wrote verses that glittered like jewels, and farmers tilled fields that fed millions. But to the arriving British traders, none of that mattered. They looked upon this land not with awe, but with calculation. Every port was a gateway, every ruler an obstacle or pawn, every person a tool or threat. They smiled with diplomacy, but behind those smiles lay contracts written in chains, treaties drenched in deception, and a future that would strip India of its very soul. At first, the mask held. Gifts were exchanged, trade agreements signed, and alliances forged. The British arrived as partners, as harmless guests, seeking only to buy and sell. But the truth behind their courtesy was darker. Every ledger filled with profit was a step toward control. Every borrowed soldier became a test of power. The empire did not come with armies at first. It came with ledgers, contracts, and lies. And slowly, quietly, it began to weave itself into the veins of nations that never realized the poison was spreading. But greed never stays quiet for long. Where trade ended, force began. The East India Company, supposedly a business, built armies larger than most kingdoms. Muskets replaced spices, cannons replaced contracts. What had been called commerce became conquest, and the line between merchant and monarch disappeared. The company wasn't simply trading anymore, it was ruling, and its rulers were men who had never seen the lands they now claimed to own. They governed through violence, fear, and divide and rule. And every decision they made brought blood to the soil. In Bengal, the betrayal struck like a knife in the dark. Nawabs who thought they were negotiating peace found themselves deceived, their armies crumbling under the weight of British firepower. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 wasn't just a clash of soldiers, it was the turning of the tide, the moment when India's fate was chained to the whims of foreign merchants. The coffers of Bengal were emptied, its riches shipped away, its people left to starve. While British investors grew fat in London, children in Bengal wasted away, their cries echoing through the silence of famine. The horror of famine became the empire's shadow. Grain was hoarded to keep markets profitable, while fields of abundance rotted under mismanagement. Villages starved as warehouses overflowed. It wasn't nature's cruelty, but man's greed that killed millions. The British called it unfortunate. The people who buried their families called it murder. And the most chilling part? This pattern would repeat again and again. Deliberate starvation as a weapon, used to control and to profit. But famine was only one face of the empire's brutality. The whip cracked on the backs of workers forced into plantations. Cotton, indigo, opium, crops that filled British markets but emptied local stomachs. Fields that once grew food now grew profit. Men became slaves in their own land. Women labored until their hands bled. Children were born into chains. And when rebellion sparked, when voices rose in defiance, the punishment came swift and merciless. Entire villages burned. Thousands executed. Resistance wasn't just crushed, it was erased. And yet, resistance kept rising. In 1857, the simmering rage exploded into a storm. The Indian rebellion was fierce, desperate, and drenched in sacrifice. Soldiers turned against their masters, farmers rose against their oppressors, and cities shook with battle cries. For a moment, it seemed as though the empire might finally crumble. But the British responded with a ferocity that froze the world. Executions lined the streets, rivers ran red, and mercy was nowhere to be found. The rebellion was drowned in blood, and from its ashes, the British crown seized direct control, transforming India into the jewel of the empire. But the jewel was nothing more than a chain. The wealth of India was drained to feed Britain's hunger. Railways were built, not for progress, but for profit and control. Laws were written not for justice, but for dominance. Every institution, every reform, every so-called advancement served one purpose: to tighten the empire's grip. And while Britain basked in industrial glory, India withered under poverty, its treasures stolen, its people silenced. Beyond India, the empire's shadow stretched further. Africa became a canvas for conquest, carved up in cold-blooded deals where rulers never consulted the people whose lives were being divided. The British flag flew over vast lands, but it didn't bring unity. It brought exploitation. The mines of Africa swallowed lives, the plantations drained blood, and entire cultures were rewritten or erased. What was sold as civilization was nothing more than domination, but domination breeds resistance. From Zulu warriors in South Africa to freedom fighters in Kenya, voices rose again and again against the British yoke. Each time, the empire answered with overwhelming violence. Concentration camps, executions, scorched earth tactics. The methods were ruthless, the cruelty unmatched. And yet, each act of repression only fueled the fire of rebellion further. The empire might silence a generation, but it could never kill the dream of freedom. Meanwhile, in Britain, the truth was hidden under layers of propaganda. The empire was painted as noble, as a bringer of progress, as the shining beacon of civilization. Children grew up reading stories of brave explorers and benevolent rulers. The blood, the chains, the graves, all were erased from the narrative. The empire sold itself as glory, while its foundations were soaked in suffering. And the most sinister part was how deeply the lie was believed. The wealth that fueled Britain's industrial revolution, the splendor of its cities, the luxury of its elite, all were built on stolen land, stolen labor, stolen lives. Every palace was a tombstone, every monument a scar. But those who lived in the empire's heart rarely saw the cost. Distance protected them from the screams. Distance blinded them from the graves. Distance allowed them to believe in the myth while millions bore the truth. Yet the truth has a way of breaking through. The world wars shook the empire's foundations. Colonized soldiers fought and died on battlefields for a crown that never cared for them. Promises of freedom were made, then broken. And as the smoke of war cleared, nations began to rise, demanding the freedom that had been stolen for centuries. The empire, once unshakable, began to fracture. But even in its dying days, it left scars that remain raw to this day. Because the dark truth of the British Empire is not just history, it is legacy. Borders drawn in greed still fuel wars. Economies built on plunder still struggle with poverty. Cultures erased still fight for recognition. And the descendants of those who suffered still carry the weight of chains that were never fully broken. The empire may have fallen, but its shadow still lingers, stretching across the world like a ghost that refuses to fade. But perhaps the darkest truth of all is not what the empire did, but how easily it was forgotten. In textbooks, in speeches, in films, the story is softened, rewritten, sanitized. The cruelty is downplayed, the victims erased, the perpetrators celebrated. And so, generation after generation grows up believing the empire was glorious, never seeing the graves beneath the crown. Yet, the graves are there. Beneath every monument, behind every museum display, in the silence of lands that once thrived before the empire's shadow fell. The truth waits to be unearthed, to be told, to be remembered. And when it is, it shakes the ground we stand on, reminding us that power is never innocent, and empires are never kind. But this is only the beginning. The British Empire's darkness stretches far beyond India and Africa. There are secrets buried in Australia, horrors etched into the Caribbean, and betrayals whispered across the Middle East. Each region holds a story of conquest, resistance, and blood. And the deeper we dig, the more chilling the truth becomes. So brace yourself, because what comes next will reveal atrocities even more haunting. The kind of truths that force you to question everything you thought you knew about history. Chains across the seas, the empire's ships did not just carry spices and silk. They carried chains. Across the Atlantic, the waves were carved by vessels heavy with human cargo, their holds packed with bodies stacked like crates. The British called it trade, but it was slavery, pure and brutal. Millions were torn from Africa, shackled, and shipped across seas they would never return from. The air inside those ships was thick with sweat, blood, and despair. And yet, to the empire, these were not human beings. They were profit margins. They were tools. They were commodities to be bought and sold. Imagine the silence of an African village, shattered by gunfire and screaming. Families ripped apart, children dragged from their mothers, elders struck down for resisting. Those captured were marched for miles, whipped if they stumbled, their futures stolen before they even reached the coast. On the beaches, ships loomed like monsters, their wooden jaws opening to swallow thousands. Once the hatches closed, darkness claimed them, a suffocating void where disease spread faster than hope, and cries of the dying became the lullaby of the living. The Middle Passage, that's what history books call it, but the name hides the truth. It was not a passage. It was a nightmare. Men, women, and children were chained to planks so tightly they could barely move. The stench of vomit and decay choked the air. Every wave slammed against the hull like a drum of death. Some chose to leap into the ocean, preferring the embrace of the sea to the torment awaiting them. And still, the ships sailed on, carrying their cargo toward plantations that would consume them like fire consumes wood. On the sugar fields of the Caribbean, the empire built its golden throne. The land was fertile, the crops lucrative, but the labor was merciless. Enslaved Africans worked under a sun that burned like judgment, their backs breaking, their hands bleeding, their lives measured, not in years, but in profit. Whips cracked like thunder, and the screams that followed were drowned by the grinding of mills crushing cane into sugar. To Britain, sugar was wealth. To the enslaved, sugar was chains. Every grain a reminder of their suffering, plantations became factories of cruelty. Overseers wielded absolute power, their punishments designed not just to hurt but to break spirits. A runaway caught might be branded, mutilated, or executed in front of others as a warning. Women endured unspeakable violations, their bodies treated as property, their children born into slavery before they could even breathe freely. The system was built to erase hope, to crush rebellion before it could spark. Yet, despite the empire's cruelty, rebellion was never truly silenced. Whispers of resistance traveled like sparks in the wind. Songs carried hidden messages, drums echoed calls to rise, and every night, dreams of freedom burned in the hearts of the enslaved. Rebellions erupted, some small, some vast. In Jamaica, in Barbados, in St. Lucia, the enslaved rose again and again, wielding whatever weapons they could find, fighting not for riches, but for the simplest right of all to live free. Each uprising was met with savage retaliation, but every drop of blood spilled only deepened the cracks in the empire's facade of control. The British masters lived in luxury, sipping tea sweetened by sugar harvested from suffering. Their estates gleamed, their wealth multiplied, and their power expanded. But they built their paradise atop graves. For every plantation mansion that stood tall, there were thousands of unmarked graves hidden beneath the soil, each one a silent accusation. And the empire knew it, which is why it worked so hard to erase the voices of the enslaved, to bury their stories, to rewrite their pain as progress. In Britain itself, the truth was hidden beneath a mask of morality. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton poured into London, Liverpool, and Bristol, fueling fortunes, financing industries, and building cities. Merchants became nobles, shipowners became lords, and the empire grew fat on the labor of those it had chained. Yet when questioned, the empire spoke of civilization, of bringing order to savages. It was the ultimate hypocrisy to enslave millions, then claim superiority over them. But the enslaved never accepted their chains quietly. In Haiti, the fire of revolution roared to life. The enslaved rose in numbers too great to suppress, their determination too fierce to extinguish. They fought, they bled, they conquered, and against all odds, they shattered the empire's hold, declaring Haiti the first free Black republic. The British, shaken and furious, responded with vengeance, attempting to crush other revolts before they could follow Haiti's path. But the message was clear. The empire's power was not eternal, and the enslaved would not remain silent forever. Back in Britain, whispers of abolition began to stir. Writers, activists, and former slaves raised their voices, painting pictures of the horrors hidden behind sugar and gold. The public, once shielded by propaganda, began to glimpse the truth. But abolition was not born of morality alone. It was also driven by fear. Rebellions grew costlier, resistance fiercer, and profits threatened. The empire calculated that ending the trade would preserve its power, even as it cloaked the decision in the language of justice. When the slave trade was finally outlawed, Britain celebrated itself as a savior, parading abolition as proof of its virtue. But behind the celebration lurked another dark truth: the enslaved were not freed immediately, and when they were, it was the slave owners, not the enslaved, who received compensation. Millions of pounds were paid out to families who had grown rich off human suffering, their fortunes secured for generations. The victims received nothing but scars. Even after abolition, the empire found new ways to bind chains. Indentured labor replaced slavery, exploiting workers from India, China, and beyond, sending them to the same plantations once worked by enslaved Africans. The system wore a new mask, but the cruelty remained the same. Men were tricked or forced into contracts that trapped them in grueling labor far from home, their lives consumed for the empire's profit. Freedom, it seemed, was always conditional under British rule. The Caribbean remained scarred long after the whips stopped cracking. Economies distorted by centuries of slavery struggled to recover. Families torn apart by the trade could never fully heal. Entire cultures had been uprooted, languages lost, histories erased. The legacy of slavery was not just chains in the past, but invisible chains in the present: poverty, inequality, and trauma that persisted through generations. And yet, in the face of that pain, resilience thrived. Music, faith, and memory carried forward the voices the empire had tried to silence. The empire, however, refused to admit its crimes. Museums in Britain displayed treasures stolen from colonies, but rarely the shackles of slavery. Statues rose in honor of men who built their wealth on human suffering. Streets bore the names of merchants who had trafficked in lives. And as centuries passed, the true story of slavery was pushed aside, buried under myths of British benevolence. The silence was not ignorance, it was deliberate, a rewriting of history to protect the empire's image. But history cannot remain buried forever. Descendants of the enslaved demand acknowledgement, demand reparations, demand truth. They dig into the archives, uncover the documents, speak the names that were erased. And as these truths resurface, they shatter the carefully crafted image of empire. Because no matter how grand the palaces, no matter how polished the monuments, the blood of the enslaved stains every stone. The British Empire was not just built on conquest. It was built on slavery. Without the plantations, without the ships, without the millions whose lives were stolen, the empire would never have risen. And that is the dark truth it still tries to deny. The wealth of London, the glory of Britain's rise, the so-called greatness of the empire All of it stands on the broken backs of those who were never meant to survive. But survival is exactly what they achieved. Against all odds, cultures flourished in defiance of empire. The rhythms of Africa merged with the Caribbean to create music that carried both sorrow and strength. Stories and traditions endured, passed down in whispers and songs. Even in the deepest night, the enslaved carried hope like a hidden flame. And that flame would one day ignite revolutions across the world, each one a step closer to tearing down the empire that had tried to erase them. The empire's leaders never expected this. They thought chains could silence forever, that fear would be eternal, that profit would always outweigh resistance. But history proved them wrong. Every rebellion, every act of defiance, every survival was a crack in their empire's armor. And as the centuries turned, those cracks widened, until the foundation itself began to tremble. Still, the empire had many faces, many weapons. If slavery could no longer be hidden, it would find new forms of domination. From Africa to Asia, from Australia to the Middle East, the empire shifted its methods, but never its purpose. Exploitation remained its core, conquest its obsession, profit its god. And what came next would reveal even more chilling truths, atrocities that dwarfed even the horrors of the slave trade, because the story does not end in the Caribbean. The empire's shadow stretched into every corner of the globe, leaving behind famines, massacres, and betrayals so vast they still echo today. And in the next chapter, we will step into Africa itself, where the British carved up entire nations, unleashed unspeakable violence, and planted seeds of conflict that burn to this very day. If you thought slavery was the empire's darkest sin, what comes next will leave you questioning whether human cruelty has any limit at all. Blood and Soil Africa, a land of vast desert, fertile valleys, dense jungles, and endless horizons. For centuries, it thrived with kingdoms, trade routes, and cultures as rich and complex as any in Europe. Empires like Mali and Songhai had risen and fallen long before Britain ever cast its gaze upon the continent. But in the late 19th century, that gaze turned into a hungry stare. Britain no longer saw Africa as a land of civilizations. It saw it as soil to be carved, veins to be drained, and people to be chained. And with that vision came one of the bloodiest chapters in human history. The so-called scramble for Africa was no accident. It was a feeding frenzy, orchestrated in smoke-filled rooms in Europe, where rulers and merchants drew lines on maps as if the continent were nothing more than a chessboard. Britain, the empire that claimed the sun never set on its dominion, wanted the lion's share. Gold, diamonds, ivory, rubber, every resource gleamed like treasure, waiting to be seized. But what Britain refused to see were the people whose lives were bound to that land, people who would pay the ultimate price for Britain's hunger. South Africa became the first stage of the empire's violent theater. The discovery of diamonds and gold transformed the region into a battlefield. The British fought brutal wars against the Zulus, a proud and powerful people whose spears clashed against rifles and cannons. The Zulu warriors fought with unmatched courage, their war cries echoing across the plains. But courage alone could not withstand British firepower. The empire crushed them with relentless force, leaving their land stripped and their people broken. But even victory wasn't enough. Greed pushed the British further, into conflict with the Boers, Dutch settlers who refused to bend to imperial rule. The Boer Wars were savage, stretching from scorched earth campaigns to the creation of something terrifyingly new: concentration camps. Civilians, women, children, the elderly were herded into camps where disease and hunger ran rampant. Thousands perished behind barbed wire, not because they fought, but because they existed. The camps were a grim foreshadowing of horrors the world would later witness on a much larger scale. And yet, South Africa was only one wound. In Kenya, the fertile highlands became the empire's playground, ceased for British settlers, while the local Kikuyu people were forced into labor. The settlers called it the White Highlands, as if renaming the land erased its history. Families who had farmed those lands for generations were suddenly trespassers on their own soil. Resistance grew, but resistance was met with whips, bullets, and prisons. Britain wasn't just stealing land, it was trying to erase the people who belonged to it. Nigeria became another jewel in the empire's bloody crown. With oil-rich lands and fertile fields, it was too valuable to ignore. British officials imposed their rule through treaties signed at gunpoint, exploiting ethnic divisions and planting seeds of conflict that would fester long after independence. The empire forced new systems of governance, dismantled traditional authority, and replaced it with a bureaucracy that served only British profit. The cost? Generations of political turmoil, bloodshed, and mistrust that still haunt the nation today. But perhaps nowhere was the empire's cruelty more chilling than in the treatment of African labor. Railways, mines, plantations, they were built not by progress, but by suffering. Africans were taxed heavily, then forced into labor to pay those taxes. Men were dragged from their homes to work in brutal conditions, while women and children were left to starve. In some regions, entire villages were punished if labor quotas weren't met. The empire called it development. The people who lived it called it slavery reborn. In Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, the pattern repeated. Vast stretches of fertile land were stolen for white settlers, while Africans were pushed into reserves, stripped of rights and dignity. The empire passed laws that reduced Africans to second-class beings in their own homeland. Those who dared resist were imprisoned or executed. And yet, the spirit of resistance never truly died. From whispered plans to open revolts, Africans clung to hope that one day the empire would be driven out. The British justified their conquests with a poisonous lie: the civilizing mission. They claimed they brought education, order, and religion to a continent they painted as savage. But the reality was exploitation, pure and simple. Schools were built to enforce obedience, not freedom. Laws were written to protect settlers, not natives. Churches often sided with colonizers, preaching submission rather than liberation. Civilization was the mask, greed was the face beneath. The brutality wasn't hidden. Reports of massacres filtered back to Britain, shocking some, but ignored by many. In places like Sudan, entire populations were cut down when they resisted British rule. Villages were burned, leaders executed, bodies left as warnings. Yet in London, newspapers spoke of victories, not atrocities. The empire's citizens consumed sanitized stories, never seeing the rivers of blood that flowed to keep their tea and sugar cheap. And then there was Uganda, where the empire's divide and rule tactics poisoned entire communities. By elevating some groups and suppressing others, the British sowed divisions that would later erupt into violence long after they left. This was the empire's lasting weapon. not just guns and chains, but division, a strategy that ensured nations would struggle long after Britain withdrew its flag. But resistance grew fiercer with every atrocity. The Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya became a thunderclap of defiance. Farmers and fighters rose against settlers, demanding their land and freedom back. The British response was ruthless: detention camps, torture, executions. The camps became laboratories of cruelty, where men were beaten, women violated, and entire communities terrorized into submission. The empire's mask of civilization slipped, revealing the predator beneath. The brutality of the Mau Mau suppression was so horrific that decades later, survivors still carried scars, physical and emotional. When documents were finally revealed, the world saw the empire's hidden crimes, secret files detailing torture, killings, and cover-ups. Britain had not just committed atrocities. It had buried the evidence, hoping history would forget. But history has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. In the mines of South Africa, Africans worked in darkness for diamonds and gold they would never touch. The wealth was shipped overseas, enriching Britain while leaving miners in poverty. Accidents, disease, and exhaustion claimed countless lives, but they were easily replaced. To the empire, miners weren't men. They were numbers on a ledger, tools to extract profit. And yet, every gem that sparkled in London's shops carried within it the suffering of those who dug it from the earth. Africa bled for Britain, but Africa also resisted. From the Ashanti Wars in Ghana to rebellions in Sudan, from uprisings in Zimbabwe to guerrilla struggles in Kenya, Africans refused to bow. For every village burned, another rose. For every leader executed, another stepped forward. The empire could suppress, but it could never fully destroy the will to be free. That will became the heartbeat of independence movements that would one day drive the empire out. And yet, independence would not heal the wounds. The borders Britain drew, the divisions it fueled, the systems it imposed, all remained, festering like open scars. Civil wars, coups, and ethnic conflicts erupted across Africa, many born directly from the empire's manipulations. The empire had left, but its shadow remained, haunting nations that struggled under the weight of a stolen past. In Britain, few spoke of the crimes. The empire was still celebrated as glorious, its statues still honored, its crimes buried under silence. The concentration camps in Kenya, the massacres in Sudan, the land theft in Zimbabwe, all reduced to footnotes, if mentioned at all. The empire's victims were expected to forget, while its victors demanded to be remembered. But the soil of Africa remembers. It remembers the blood spilled, the lives stolen, the futures denied. It remembers the cries of mothers watching their children starve, the chants of warriors charging against impossible odds, the silence of graves dug too shallow. And in that memory lies truth, a truth the empire cannot erase, no matter how many monuments it builds. The British Empire claimed it brought progress, but what it truly brought was plunder. Africa's riches were stripped, its people exploited, its future mortgaged to feed Britain's greed. The cost was measured in millions of lives, in broken nations, in suffering that echoes still. And the darkest part? This was only one chapter of the empire's story. Beyond Africa lay other lands, other atrocities, other scars, because even as Africa burned under British rule, the empire's ships sailed further east, into the Middle East, a region where betrayal and manipulation would reach new depths. Promises were made, then broken. Nations were carved apart with pen strokes as cruel as any sword. And in those betrayals, seeds of conflict were planted that still ignite wars today. If Africa showed us the empire's cruelty, the Middle East would reveal its cunning, a darkness woven not just in blood, but in lies. Promises in the sand, the Middle East, a land of deserts and rivers, prophets and empires, crossroads of civilizations for thousands of years. By the dawn of the 20th century, it was also a land sitting atop riches the world had only begun to understand. Oil. To the British Empire, the Middle East was more than sand and history. It was the key to power, to war, to energy that would fuel industries and armies. And so, Britain entered not just with soldiers, but with promises that would be written in lies, sealed in betrayal, and paid for in generations of blood. During the First World War, Britain knew it needed allies. The Ottoman Empire ruled vast territories in the Middle East, and its collapse was inevitable. Britain whispered to the Arab leaders, "Rise against the Ottomans, and we will grant you freedom. Fight by our side, and you shall have your own nations." The words carried hope like rain on desert sand. The Arabs believed them. From Mecca to Damascus, tribes and fighters rallied, convinced that at last, after centuries of foreign rule, they were on the verge of true independence. Figures like Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his son stood at the center of this dream. They raised the Arab revolt, banners of red, green, and black fluttering across the desert. The legendary Lawrence of Arabia fought alongside them, promising Britain's support, swearing that freedom would be theirs. And as Arab fighters captured towns and pushed back Ottoman forces, they believed they were carving the path to liberation. What they didn't know was that, even as they bled in the sands, Britain was carving a different path, one paved with deception, because in secret, Britain had already made another deal. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed in 1916, carved the Middle East between Britain and France like butchers dividing a carcass. Syria and Lebanon to France, Iraq and Palestine to Britain. The Arabs who fought with faith and sacrifice had no seat at the table, no voice in the decision. The ink on the promise of freedom was still drying, even as Britain sold their future to another empire. The betrayal was complete before the war had even ended, and yet Britain didn't stop at betrayal. In 1917, another declaration was made, the Balfour Declaration. In a single sentence, Britain promised to establish a homeland for Jews in Palestine without consulting the Arabs who already lived there. To Jewish communities fleeing persecution in Europe, it was a glimmer of hope. To Palestinians, it was a death sentence for their future sovereignty. Britain had promised the same land to two peoples, ensuring conflict that would ignite fires lasting more than a century. After the war, the Ottoman Empire crumbled, and the Middle East awaited freedom. Instead, Britain and France arrived with mandates, a polite word for colonization. Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine fell under British control. Flags were raised, parliaments claimed authority, but the power lay in London, not in Baghdad or Jerusalem. The Arabs realized too late that their sacrifice had bought them nothing but new chains, chains forged not in steel, but in treaties written in betrayal. In Iraq, resentment exploded. The 1920 revolt saw tribes, clerics, and common people rise against British rule, demanding the independence they had been promised. For months, Iraq burned. The British, unable to crush resistance with conventional force, turned to new weapons: the Royal Air Force. Villages were bombed from the sky, crops destroyed, civilians targeted. Some British officials even suggested using poison gas to silence uprisings. Independence was not granted, it was crushed beneath wings of terror. Palestine became the empire's most volatile wound. Jewish immigration increased under British mandate, fueling tensions with Arab communities who felt their land slipping away. Protests erupted, strikes paralyzed cities, and clashes grew bloody. Britain, caught in the storm it had created, alternated between promises and crackdowns, between empty words and brutal repression. Every decision only deepened the divide, setting the stage for a conflict that has never ended. The seeds Britain planted with its duplicity continue to bear bitter fruit, decade after decade. In Jordan, Britain played its favorite game: divide and rule. It elevated Sharif Hussein's son, Abdullah, to the throne, creating a kingdom that was loyal not to its people, but to British interests. Britain armed and trained Jordan's army, ensuring it could serve imperial strategies in the region. To London, Jordan was a buffer zone, a piece of the chessboard. To the people, it was another reminder that their destiny had been stolen by promises written in sand. And then there was Egypt. Though technically independent after 1922, Britain maintained a stranglehold over its politics, its economy, and most of all, the Suez Canal. This narrow waterway was the empire's lifeline, the passage that linked Britain to its colonies in India and beyond. Britain claimed it protected the canal for global trade, but the truth was simple. Whoever controlled the Suez controlled the empire's heartbeat. And so, Egypt's independence was a hollow shell, its sovereignty shackled to Britain's ambitions. The British Empire treated oil as its lifeblood, and in the Middle East, it found rivers of it. In Iraq and Iran, British companies seized oil fields, ensuring that the wealth of nations flowed not to their people, but to British coffers. Pipelines stretched across deserts, guarded by soldiers, feeding the empire's industries and fleets. The people who lived above these riches remained poor, watching as their land was drained of its future. Britain called it partnership. The locals called it theft. Resistance was inevitable. In Palestine, the 1936 Arab Revolt erupted, a desperate cry against both British control and the growing displacement of Palestinians. Britain answered with iron fists: collective punishments, executions, mass arrests. Villages were razed, leaders exiled, prisons filled. Britain claimed it was restoring order. In truth, it was ensuring chaos, planting resentments so deep they would bleed into every generation that followed. In Iraq, resentment never truly faded. During World War II, Britain returned with military force to crush nationalist uprisings and secure oil. The empire spoke of defending democracy, but its actions revealed the truth. Britain cared nothing for the will of the people. It cared only for oil, land, and power. The Middle East became not a partner in war, but a pawn in Britain's game, sacrificed whenever it suited imperial strategy. And then came 1948. Britain's withdrawal from Palestine left behind a storm. The empire had promised too much to too many, and when it finally left, it left chaos in its wake. War erupted between Arabs and the newly declared State of Israel. Refugees fled in hundreds of thousands, Villages disappeared. Lives were shattered. The British Empire washed its hands of the blood, walking away as if its lies had not set the stage for endless conflict. In Egypt, the resentment boiled over in 1952 when revolution swept the country, toppling the monarchy Britain had propped up. For the first time, Egypt stood on its own, but Britain's shadow lingered in the Suez Canal. In 1956, when Egypt nationalized the canal, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched an invasion. Tanks rolled, bombs fell, but this time, the empire's arrogance collided with reality. The world no longer bowed to Britain, and the empire's weakness was laid bare for all to see. The Suez Crisis was more than a military defeat. It was the death knell of Britain's global dominance. The empire had gambled everything to keep control of a strip of water and lost. But in its loss, it left behind devastation, wars, uprisings, and divisions that shaped the Middle East for decades. The promises Britain had made were ashes, and the betrayals it had sown had become fires no one could put out. But perhaps the cruelest betrayal was not just political. It was cultural. Britain redrew borders without care for the people who lived within them, splitting tribes, uniting rivals, fracturing centuries-old identities. Nations were forced into molds that did not fit, their histories rewritten, their futures hijacked. The empire left behind maps that were traps, each border a fault line ready to erupt in war. And erupt they did, again and again. To this day, the Middle East carries the weight of those betrayals. Every war, every conflict, every refugee camp can trace a line back to promises Britain never kept, deals it made in secret, and lies it told in pursuit of power. The empire may be gone, but its ghost lingers in the sand, whispering in every broken treaty, every ruined city, every displaced family. And yet, even here, resistance never died. From guerrilla fighters to nationalist leaders, from poets to revolutionaries, the Middle East rose again and again against British control. The empire could manipulate, but it could not fully silence. The voices of resistance became the heartbeat of independence movements, carrying forward the dream the empire had tried so hard to bury beneath lies. But as the Middle East burned with betrayal, Britain's ships were already sailing further east toward Asia. And in Asia, the empire's cruelty would find new depths. From the betrayal of promises in the deserts, we move to the betrayal of humanity in the jungles and rice fields. The story of the British Empire does not grow lighter, it grows darker still. Because in Asia, the empire left scars so deep that even today, they bleed. Shadows in the East Asia, a continent of dynasties, ancient kingdoms, and bustling trade routes that had thrived for centuries before Britain set its sights upon it. From the temples of Burma to the ports of Malaya, from the crowded alleys of Hong Kong to the lush plantations of Ceylon, the empire arrived like a shadow, cloaked in commerce but carrying chains. To Britain, Asia was not a partner in trade, it was a treasure chest waiting to be forced open. And when the lock didn't yield to diplomacy, Britain used cannons, bayonets, and hunger to break it apart. One of the empire's most ruthless plays came in China. The British wanted tea, oceans of it, but they had little China desired in return. The solution Britain chose was poison, opium. Poppy fields in India became factories of addiction. Their harvest turned into a drug that flooded Chinese markets. Millions became dependent, families crumbled, society buckled. When Chinese officials tried to resist, Britain declared war, calling it the defense of free trade. In reality, it was the defense of drug trafficking on a colossal scale. The Opium Wars shattered China. British gunboats unleashed their fury on Chinese ports, blasting fortifications to rubble. Ancient cities fell under bombardment, their defenses powerless against modern firepower. The treaties that followed were not agreements, they were humiliations carved in ink. China was forced to open its ports, hand over territory, and bow to Britain's demands. The jewel of this conquest was Hong Kong, seized not as a colony of pride, but as a warehouse of control, a gateway for Britain's opium empire. In Hong Kong, Britain built a fortress of trade and governance, ruling over Chinese residents with laws they never consented to. The city grew into a hub of commerce, but its wealth flowed outward, enriching Britain while leaving locals subject to foreign rulers who viewed them as second class. Britain called it progress. For those forced under its laws, it was subjugation, hidden beneath neon lights and busy harbors. Further south, in Malaya, the empire's hunger turned to tin and rubber. Vast plantations stretched across the land, worked by laborers who toiled from dawn to dusk under watchful overseers. Rubber fueled Britain's industries, tin lined its coffers, but the workers saw none of that wealth. Many were brought from India and China as indentured laborers, trapped in cycles of debt and exploitation. Malaya's prosperity was a mask, its glitter hiding the sweat and blood of those who built it. In Burma, the conquest was brutal. Britain invaded in waves, dismantling the monarchy and annexing the kingdom into its empire. Burmese culture, deeply tied to its monarchy and traditions, was humiliated under colonial rule. Land was seized, forests plundered, rice exported for profit while locals suffered. Resistance flared in the form of guerrilla warfare, but each uprising was met with the full weight of British guns. The empire spoke of order, but what it imposed was silence, the silence of graves and burned villages. Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, became another jewel in Britain's crown of exploitation. Tea plantations covered the hills, producing leaves that filled British teacups while Tamil laborers bent under the strain of endless work. The empire called them coolies, stripping them of names, dignity, and freedom. Generations lived and died on plantations, their lives consumed by a crop they would never taste in the comfort of leisure. The beauty of Ceylon's hills was a cruel contrast to the suffering hidden within them. But the empire's cruelty wasn't only economic, it was psychological. In schools across Asia, British authorities taught that colonial rule was civilization, that Asian cultures were backward, and that progress meant obedience to empire. Languages were suppressed, histories rewritten, traditions mocked. The empire didn't just aim to control bodies, it sought to colonize minds, to create generations who doubted their own worth and saw their rulers as saviors rather than oppressors. Yet even under this suffocating control, resistance smoldered. Secret societies in Malaya plotted against British rule. Buddhist monks in Burma carried forward the spirit of defiance. Nationalists in Ceylon and Hong Kong whispered of freedom in back rooms and marketplaces. The empire called them rebels and criminals, but history would call them visionaries. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, was a seed of independence waiting to grow. World War II turned Asia into a battlefield once more. Japanese forces swept through Malaya, Hong Kong, and Burma, shattering the illusion of British invincibility. Locals who had been told Britain was their eternal protector watched as the empire crumbled overnight. The myth of British superiority cracked, and in that crack, the light of independence began to shine. Britain would return after the war, but it would never again be seen as unbreakable. But the war also revealed the empire's ruthlessness. In Bengal, under British rule, famine struck in 1943. Millions starved as grain was diverted to feed the war effort and markets manipulated for profit. Children wasted away on the streets while British officials dined in luxury. Winston Churchill, the empire's war leader, dismissed their suffering with cold indifference. The famine was not a tragedy of nature, it was a crime of policy, one of the darkest stains on the empire's record. After the war, resistance became unstoppable. In Burma, independence fighters clashed with the British until freedom was finally achieved in 1948. In Malaya, insurgencies raged, forcing Britain into brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. Villages were relocated, civilians detained, and collective punishments imposed. The empire called it the emergency, but for those who lived it, it was another war of survival, another chapter of suffering under foreign rule. In Hong Kong, Britain clung tightly, unwilling to let go of its prized colony. It grew into a financial hub, but beneath its glitter, inequality thrived. Refugees from mainland China filled cramped tenements, working long hours for scraps while British elites lived in comfort. The colony became a paradox, a place of opportunity for some, but always under the shadow of rulers who were never elected, who governed without consent. In Ceylon, independence came with chains still intact. The economy remained tied to tea, the politics divided by the legacies of colonial manipulation. Britain left, but it left behind fault lines that would erupt into future conflict. The empire's hand could still be felt in every plantation, every political division, every scar. What made Asia's experience so haunting was the scale of betrayal. Britain had promised partnership, progress, and protection. Instead, it delivered addiction, famine, and exploitation. The riches of Asia flowed out like rivers, filling Britain's coffers while leaving behind poverty and trauma. And when resistance grew too strong, Britain did not bow gracefully. It lashed out with violence, determined to remind its colonies who truly held the whip. Yet, the people never stopped fighting. From students marching in Rangoon to workers striking in Malaya, from monks preaching resistance in Burma to writers in Hong Kong penning truths in secret, Asia rose, voice by voice, step by step. The empire had the guns, but the people had memory, and memory is a weapon that cannot be silenced forever. By the mid-20th century, the empire's grip on Asia was loosening. One by one, nations claimed their freedom, though the cost was high. Independence came not as a gift, but as a prize wrested from a reluctant oppressor. Britain left, but it left behind scars. Borders that divided families, economies built for extraction, not growth, cultures reshaped under colonial arrogance. The price of empire was still being paid long after the flag was lowered, and yet, Britain's narrative back home remained unchanged. The empire was still painted as benevolent, its crimes buried beneath words like development and progress. The famine in Bengal was rarely spoken of, the opium wars dismissed as old quarrels, the suffering in plantations erased from memory. The British public saw only the polished mask, never the broken faces hidden behind it. But truth has a way of resurfacing. Survivors spoke, documents leaked, histories reclaimed. Slowly, the empire's crimes in Asia began to emerge into light. And what they revealed was not a story of glory, but of greed, brutality, and betrayal. Asia had been a proving ground for the empire's hunger, a place where profit mattered more than human life, and where promises were worth less than the ink used to write them. And yet, Asia was not the empire's final act of cruelty. Across the seas, another land was marked for domination, a land Britain called Terra Nullius, as if it were empty, though it was alive with cultures thousands of years old. Australia and the Pacific would bear witness to another chapter of dispossession and brutality. If Asia showed us the empire's hunger for wealth, the Pacific would reveal its hunger for land, a hunger that erased entire peoples in the name of empire. The stolen earth imagines standing on a land that has been home to your ancestors for more than 60,000 years. A land where every mountain, every river, every tree carries stories passed down through countless generations. This was Australia before the British arrived, a continent alive with culture, songlines, and spiritual connection to the earth. To the British, however, it was empty. They used the legal fiction of terra nullius, nobody's land, to claim ownership, as though the people who had lived there since time immemorial were invisible. This was the first lie, the foundation of conquest. The first fleet arrived in 1788, carrying convicts, soldiers, and officials to establish a penal colony. Britain had lost its American colonies and needed somewhere new to dump its unwanted. Australia was chosen. But from the moment British boots touched the soil at Botany Bay, the clash began. Indigenous people resisted, defending their homes, their families, their land. The British, armed with muskets and disease, unleashed a slow-moving catastrophe that would devastate entire nations across the continent. Disease was the first invader. Smallpox swept through Aboriginal communities with ferocity, wiping out populations who had no immunity. Families disappeared overnight, villages fell silent, elders who held centuries of knowledge were lost forever. To the British, this was seen as convenient, fewer people to resist their expansion. But for the First Nations, it was the apocalypse, an invisible enemy that arrived with the newcomers and tore through generations. When disease was not enough, violence followed. Frontier wars erupted across Australia as Aboriginal warriors fought against British expansion. These were not isolated skirmishes, they were wars of resistance, stretching for more than a century. Spears clashed with rifles. Courage stood against gunpowder. But the British held the advantage, and for every battle fought, massacres followed. At Mile Creek, at Pinjarra, at countless sites never recorded in official history, entire communities were slaughtered, their names erased from maps. The British called it settlement. In truth, it was dispossession. Land was seized, rivers fenced, hunting grounds turned into sheep pastures. The sacred bond between people and land was broken, replaced by deeds of ownership and barbed wire. For Indigenous Australians, this was more than theft. It was the destruction of their very way of life. Every acre taken was a wound that bled into generations. Children were not spared. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, British authorities implemented policies that tore Aboriginal children from their families, placing them in missions and institutions. This became known as the Stolen Generations. Children were stripped of their language, their culture, their names. They were told to forget who they were, to become what the empire wanted: obedient subjects, erased of their heritage. The scars of this policy still run deep, a living legacy of empire's cruelty. Meanwhile, Britain built Australia as a colony for itself. Gold rushes, sheep stations, and vast cities rose, built on land taken by force. The wealth flowed into the empire, strengthening its global reach. But the cost was paid by indigenous peoples who were pushed to the margins, denied rights, treated as outsiders in their own country. Australia became the lucky country, lucky for settlers, tragic for those who had called it home for millennia. Across the sea, in New Zealand, a similar story unfolded. The Maori people, warriors with their own proud traditions, initially engaged in trade with the British. But as settlers poured in, pressure on land grew unbearable. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, was supposed to guarantee Maori rights while allowing British settlement. Instead, it became a weapon of deception. The English version promised protection. The Maori version implied partnership. The British enforced only the version that suited them. The result was war. From the 1840s to the 1870s, the New Zealand Wars raged as Maori fought to defend their land from British seizure. Villages were burned, lands confiscated, people forced into exile. The Maori, fierce and determined, fought with unmatched bravery, but the empire's military machine was relentless. By the time the wars ended, vast swaths of Maori land were gone, swallowed into settler farms and towns. Yet, the Maori spirit endured. Even in the face of loss, they kept their culture alive through haka, through language, through resistance. Britain sought to assimilate them, to erase their identity, but the Maori refused to vanish. Their survival became a living act of defiance, a refusal to let the empire write them out of history. But the wounds remained. Land gone, sovereignty denied, promises broken. Farther into the Pacific, Britain's reach extended to islands scattered across the vast ocean. Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and others fell under colonial control. Here, the empire's hunger took a new form: labor. Plantations needed workers, and when locals resisted, Britain imported indentured laborers from India and other colonies. Men and women were shipped across oceans, forced into backbreaking work under contracts that trapped them in cycles of poverty. The Pacific Islands became factories of sugar and cotton, their wealth siphoned away, their people displaced. In Fiji, indigenous chiefs signed treaties under pressure, ceding land to the empire. In return, Britain imposed new systems of governance, pushing aside traditional structures. Islanders became strangers in their own land, caught between the weight of empire and the exploitation of plantations. Those who resisted were punished, those who complied were manipulated. In every case, the outcome was the same. Britain's power grew, while the island's autonomy shrank. Even in the smallest islands, Britain's presence left deep marks. Missionaries arrived with the cross, declaring local traditions heathen and savage. Cultures that had thrived for centuries were condemned as primitive, their practices suppressed, their gods silenced. Colonization was not just about land, it was about control of the soul. Britain wanted not just subjects, but believers in its superiority. And too often, it succeeded by force. But the Pacific also became a laboratory for Britain's cruelty. Entire communities were displaced to make way for plantations or military bases. The empire looked at the islands not as homes, but as resources, stepping stones in the ocean, useful for profit or war. Islanders who resisted were labeled savages, their humanity denied. And once again, the narrative in London spoke of civilization, while the reality on the ground was exploitation. By the late 19th century, the Pacific was carved into spheres of influence by European empires. Britain, Germany, and France divided islands with lines on a map, ignoring the people who lived there. For indigenous communities, the future was decided in foreign capitals they would never see, their destinies traded like poker chips in a game they never joined. This was the arrogance of empire, to act as if the world belonged only to those who claimed it. The empire's impact on the Pacific was not just immediate, it was generational. Languages were lost, land stolen, cultures fractured. The descendants of indentured laborers remained scattered, their identities shaped by colonial policies. Indigenous peoples continue to fight for recognition, for sovereignty, for the right to their own history. The empire may be gone, but its shadow stretches across every island, every shore, and yet resistance never ceased. From Aboriginal warriors in Australia to Maori chiefs in New Zealand, from islanders in Fiji to workers in plantations, the people rose. Sometimes in battle, sometimes in song, sometimes in quiet endurance. Their survival itself was resistance, a refusal to be erased. The empire could kill, steal, and divide, but it could not completely destroy. That survival is the truest indictment of empire, proof that its victory was never total. Still, the British Empire managed to turn entire continents into colonies, entire peoples into subjects. Its crimes in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific are often the least spoken of, buried beneath myths of discovery and settlement. But beneath the silence lies the truth. It was not discovery, but invasion. Not settlement, but theft. Not civilization, but destruction. And as Britain spread across oceans, its hunger grew sharper. Land was not enough. Resources were not enough. The empire wanted control over the very hearts of nations, and nowhere was this desire clearer than in Africa. There, Britain would stage its bloodiest conquests, its most ruthless exploitation, and its deepest betrayals. The sands of Australia and the islands of the Pacific had been stolen, but Africa would become a theater of conquest on an unimaginable scale, from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Congo, from the mines of South Africa to the savannas of Kenya. Britain's shadow stretched wider than ever. And in Africa, the empire's mask of civilization would fall away entirely, revealing not progress, but plunder. The stage was set for the darkest chapter yet. Blood and Diamonds Africa, a continent of kingdoms, empires, and communities with histories stretching back thousands of years. From the libraries of Timbuktu to the warriors of Zulu, from the pyramids of the Nile to the trading kingdoms of West Africa, this was no dark continent. It was vibrant, alive, and sophisticated. But to the British Empire, Africa was not a place of people. It was a map of resources, carved into diamonds, gold, rubber, and land. And the empire would stop at nothing to claim them. Britain's first shadow fell through the Atlantic slave trade. For centuries, British ships carried millions of Africans across the ocean, chained in holds, packed so tightly that many suffocated before reaching the Americas. The empire built vast fortunes on this trade: sugar in the Caribbean, cotton in the Americas, all paid for in African lives. Even after Britain abolished the trade in 1807, its legacy remained. Broken societies, millions dead, and economies warped for the empire's gain. When slavery ended, Britain did not leave Africa. Instead, it tightened its grip. The 19th century brought the scramble for Africa, when European powers gathered in Berlin to divide the continent like vultures over a carcass. No African leaders were invited to the table. The land, the people, the resources, all were parceled out with a few strokes of a pen. For Britain, the richest prizes were Egypt, Sudan, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and beyond. Egypt was Britain's gateway to empire. Control of the Suez Canal meant control of trade with India and Asia. When Egyptian nationalists rose to reclaim their land, Britain responded with occupation in 1882. The Egyptians spoke of independence, but the empire ruled from behind the scenes, controlling banks, trade, and the army. Egypt's sovereignty became a puppet show, its strings pulled from London. In Sudan, the empire faced fierce resistance. The modest uprising in the 1880s challenged British control with fire and faith, uniting tribes under one banner. But Britain answered with the Maxim gun, the first machine gun. At the Battle of Omdurman, 11,000 Sudanese fighters were slaughtered in hours, while Britain lost fewer than 50 men. It was not a battle. It was industrialized killing. The empire called it a victory. History calls it a massacre. South Africa was another jewel Britain coveted, not for land, but for what lay beneath it, diamonds and gold. Cecil Rhodes, the face of British greed, envisioned a continent ruled by empire, stretching from Cape to Cairo. To achieve it, Britain waged brutal wars against both the Boers, Dutch settlers, and indigenous Africans. The Boer War introduced a weapon of cruelty that would later haunt the world: concentration camps. Tens of thousands of Boer women and children were imprisoned in camps, starved, and left to die from disease. Black South Africans were also forced into camps, used as laborers under horrific conditions. The camps became factories of death, a preview of the horrors the 20th century would bring. And all of it, every drop of blood, was to secure diamonds and gold for the empire. In Kenya, fertile lands were seized and handed to white settlers. The Kikuyu, Maasai, and others were driven from their ancestral soil, forced into reserves where poverty and hunger spread. Resistance brewed quietly until it erupted decades later in the Mau Mau uprising. Britain's response was merciless. Villages burned, thousands executed, hundreds of thousands detained in camps where torture and abuse were rampant. The empire painted it as law and order. The truth was systematic terror. Nigeria became Britain's laboratory of exploitation. Its diverse kingdoms and peoples were forced together under a single colony, governed not for unity, but for control. Britain drained palm oil, cocoa, and minerals, while ruling through indirect rule, empowering local chiefs to serve empire's interests. The seeds of division were planted deep, ensuring Nigeria's struggles long after independence. For Britain, Nigeria was a success. For Nigerians, it was a wound that still bleeds. In Ghana, the story was the same. Gold mines swallowed laborers whole, their sweat enriching empire. Cocoa farms thrived, but the profits flowed to Britain. When protests grew, they were met with gunfire. The empire could not tolerate voices of independence, even as it preached democracy at home. For the colonized, freedom was a dream. for the colonizers, profit was the only reality. The British Empire justified its rule with the myth of civilization. Schools were built, but only to create clerks for colonial offices. Roads and railways were constructed, but only to extract resources faster. Healthcare was introduced, but only where it served the labor force. The empire's gifts were traps, tools of control disguised as progress. But Africa did not remain silent. Rebellions ignited from coast to coast. The Zulu fought fiercely against British invasion, defeating them at Isandlwana in 1879, a shocking victory that shook the empire's arrogance. The Asante resisted in Ghana, the Nandi in Kenya, the Igbo in Nigeria. Each resistance was met with overwhelming force, but together they carved the memory of defiance deep into the continent's history. World War I turned Africa into a battlefield, with millions of Africans forced to fight and labor for Britain's war. They were promised recognition, even independence, for their sacrifices. Instead, they returned home to the same chains, the same exploitation. Resentment grew, fueled by betrayal, and the fire of nationalism began to burn brighter. World War II only deepened the contradiction. Britain claimed to fight against fascism and tyranny, yet maintained its own tyranny across Africa. African soldiers fought in Europe and Asia, seeing firsthand the hypocrisy of empire. When they returned, they were no longer willing to bow quietly. The stage was set for independence movements that would shake the empire to its core. But before independence came, there was more blood. In 1948, apartheid rose in South Africa, cemented by the structures Britain had left behind. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion raged, and Britain unleashed one of its most brutal counterinsurgencies. Detainees were beaten, castrated, executed, their bodies hidden in shallow graves. The empire claimed it was saving Kenya from chaos. In truth, it was destroying lives to preserve power. Across Africa, prisons overflowed with nationalists. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, countless others endured years behind bars. Britain hoped to break them, but instead, prison turned them into symbols of resistance, heroes in the eyes of their people. The empire's chains forged the leaders who would eventually shatter them. By the 1950s and 60s, the tide was unstoppable. One by one, nations declared independence. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, Zambia, Malawi, and more. Britain left, but it did not leave clean. It left behind borders drawn for its convenience, economies built for its profit, and divisions it had exploited for decades. The scars of empire were written into the very structure of African states, and yet Britain celebrated its withdrawal as proof of benevolence. It called the process decolonization, as if it were an orderly gift rather than a desperate retreat. The crimes, the massacres, the plunder, all were swept under rugs, hidden from history books. In Britain's memory, empire was a story of progress. In Africa's memory, it was a story of blood. Diamonds glittered in London, but they were stained with African blood. Gold filled British banks, but it was mined by broken hands. Railways stretched across the continent, but they were laid on the backs of the enslaved. The empire built its wealth on Africa's suffering, and no amount of rewriting can erase that truth. But even as Africa rose from empire's chains, Britain's shadow stretched elsewhere. The Caribbean, too, had been a factory of suffering, sugar plantations drenched in slavery, rebellions drowned in blood, and a diaspora scattered across oceans. If Africa revealed the empire's hunger for land and resources, the Caribbean revealed its hunger for human lives. And in those islands, the empire's darkest nightmares of rebellion would come to life. Chains and sugar, the Caribbean, turquoise waters, lush islands, and endless sunshine. To the British Empire, however, it was not paradise. It was profit. These islands became engines of wealth, powered by sugar, the white gold that sweetened British tables and fueled its economy. But behind every spoonful of sugar was a story of unimaginable suffering. For the empire's wealth was built on the backs of enslaved Africans whose sweat and blood soaked the soil of the Caribbean. From the 17th century onward, Britain turned islands like Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua into vast sugar plantations. The system was brutal. Africans were captured, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage. Packed into ships like cargo, thousands died before even reaching the islands. Those who survived faced a life that was often worse than death. Endless toil under the blazing sun, beatings for the slightest resistance, and no hope of freedom. The plantation was a world of horror. Enslaved men, women, and children worked from dawn to dusk, cutting cane, boiling it in scorching cauldrons, enduring backbreaking labor day after day. Overseers wielded whips with merciless cruelty, enforcing obedience through terror. Disease spread rapidly, malnutrition weakened bodies, and life expectancy was appallingly short. In Britain, sugar was consumed in tea and desserts. In the Caribbean, sugar consumed human lives. Resistance, however, was never extinguished. Across the Caribbean, enslaved people rebelled, sometimes in small acts of defiance, sometimes in open revolt. They sabotaged tools, slowed work, and escaped into the mountains to form maroon communities. These maroons, made up of runaway slaves, fought guerrilla wars against British soldiers, carving out spaces of freedom in the wilderness. They were hunted relentlessly, but their survival was proof that the human spirit cannot be fully broken. Some rebellions shook the empire to its core. In Jamaica, the 1760 Takis War saw hundreds of enslaved Africans rise up, seizing plantations and weapons. Though brutally suppressed, it terrified the colonizers. Every plantation owner lived in fear that the enslaved would one day rise as one and sweep them away. The Caribbean was not a paradise for the British. It was a powder keg, ready to explode. The greatest explosion came not in a British colony, but in nearby Saint-Domingue, where enslaved Africans rose in 1791 and through years of bloody struggle, created Haiti, the first free black republic. For Britain, this was a nightmare. The Haitian Revolution inspired hope among the enslaved and dread among the masters. Britain tried to crush it, sending armies, but the revolutionaries proved unstoppable. The message was clear. Empire's chains could be broken. Britain responded to this growing threat with even harsher control. Slave codes dictated every aspect of life, from movement to marriage. Punishments were designed to terrorize: whippings, mutilations, executions. Plantation owners knew that fear was the only thing keeping rebellion at bay. But no matter how harsh the repression, rebellion continued, because no human being accepts chains forever. By the late 18th century, winds of change began to stir. In Britain itself, abolitionists raised their voices. exposing the horrors of the slave trade. Figures like Olata Equiano, a former slave, told their stories, shaking the conscience of some in Britain. Campaigns grew, and in 1807, the British Parliament abolished the transatlantic slave trade. But abolition of the trade did not mean freedom. Slavery itself continued in the Caribbean for decades. The enslaved knew this all too well. In 1816, in Barbados, the Busa Rebellion erupted. Thousands rose against their masters, demanding liberty. British troops crushed it with brutal force, but the spark could not be extinguished. Similar uprisings followed in Demerara in 1823 and Jamaica in 1831. Each time, the empire responded with violence. Each time, the call for freedom grew louder. The Jamaican Rebellion of 1831, led by Samuel Sharp, was particularly devastating to British confidence. Tens of thousands of enslaved people joined, burning plantations, demanding freedom. The revolt was drowned in blood. Sharp himself was executed, but it marked a turning point. Britain realized slavery could no longer be sustained. The cost of repression was too high, and the world was watching. In 1833, the British Parliament finally passed the Slavery Abolition Act. But even in freedom, the cruelty of empire continued. Plantation owners were compensated for their loss of property. The enslaved received nothing. Worse, they were forced into a system called apprenticeship, where they continued to work for their former masters under slightly altered conditions. Freedom came slowly, begrudgingly, and always on the empire's terms. Yet, emancipation changed everything. Across the Caribbean, freed people began building new lives, forming communities, and reclaiming dignity. They established churches, schools, and villages, determined to create a future stolen for generations. But Britain still held power. Land was scarce, wages were low, and economic dependency kept the Caribbean tied to empire. Chains had been broken, but new ones had been forged, chains of poverty and exploitation. As the 19th century moved forward, Britain brought indentured laborers from India, China, and elsewhere to replace enslaved labor. These workers, lured by promises of opportunity, found themselves trapped in systems of exploitation not far removed from slavery. They toiled in the fields, living in cramped conditions, their contracts binding them to plantations. Once again, Britain found a way to keep the sugar flowing and the profits intact. The Caribbean became a crucible of cultures: African, Indian, Chinese, European, all shaped by empire's policies. But this diversity was not the product of harmony. It was the legacy of displacement, of forced migration, of exploitation. The empire celebrated the Caribbean's rich culture, ignoring the suffering that had created it. For those who lived it, the memory of chains was never far away. Resistance never ended. Freed people organized strikes and protests, demanding better wages and rights. In 1865, in Morin Bay, Jamaica, a protest over land and justice turned into an uprising. The British governor responded with savagery. Hundreds executed, thousands flogged, entire communities terrorized. Empire's message was clear: freedom would always exist under its shadow, never beyond it. But the shadow could not last forever. By the 20th century, new movements rose. Marcus Garvey in Jamaica spoke of Black pride and Pan-Africanism, inspiring millions around the world. Labor unions, political parties, and nationalists challenged British control, demanding true independence. The empire tried to delay, to placate, to silence. But the Caribbean was no longer willing to wait. The Second World War became the breaking point. Caribbean soldiers fought for Britain, believing promises of respect and reform. When they returned, they found nothing had changed. Poverty persisted, discrimination remained, and opportunities were scarce. Frustration boiled over into unrest, and the demand for independence became unstoppable. By the mid-20th century, one by one, Caribbean nations claimed their sovereignty. Jamaica in 1962, Trinidad and Tobago the same year, Barbados in 1966, and more followed. Britain's grip finally loosened, but it did not release its hold completely. The Caribbean economies remained tied to Britain, their futures still shaped by centuries of exploitation. Independence was real, but it carried the weight of empire's legacy. And so, the Caribbean today carries scars that trace back to Britain's greed for sugar. The wealth of empire was built on slavery, on chains, on blood spilled across these islands. Britain may speak of tropical holidays and cultural beauty, but beneath the palm trees lies a history of horror, one that cannot be erased, no matter how sweet the sugar tasted. But while the Caribbean fought for survival, Britain turned its gaze closer to home. In Ireland, just across the sea, empire's cruelty took another form: famine, oppression, and centuries of domination. If the Caribbean was the empire's laboratory of slavery, Ireland became its testing ground for colonization. And in Ireland, Britain's brutality would spark a resistance that burned for generations. Famine and Fire Ireland, green hills, rolling fields, songs of sorrow carried by the wind. But beneath its beauty lay centuries of chains. For the British Empire, Ireland was not just a neighbor, it was a possession. And for hundreds of years, the Irish people lived under the shadow of conquest, forced to endure land seizures, religious persecution, and a slow erosion of their very identity. Ireland was Britain's first colony, and one of its cruelest experiments. The conquest began in the 12th century, but reached its brutal peak under the Tudors and Stuarts. English armies marched through Ireland, seizing land from native clans, crushing uprisings, and planting settlers loyal to the crown. The Irish Catholic majority was pushed off fertile land, reduced to tenants on soil they once owned. Their fate was written in law. Dispossession became their inheritance, and poverty their companion. Religion deepened the divide. Penal laws targeted Catholics, stripping them of rights to own property, hold office, or even educate their children. Ireland was to be broken, reshaped into Britain's image, its traditions erased. The Irish language was suppressed, Gaelic culture mocked, and the people themselves treated as inferior. Britain saw Ireland not as a partner, but as a subject to be subdued at any cost. Yet resistance flared again and again. From the 9 Years' War under Hugh O'Neill to the rebellion of 1641, the Irish fought desperately for their land and faith. Each uprising was met with ferocious retribution. Cromwell's campaign in the 1650s became a byword for terror. Massacres in Drogheda and Wexford, villages burned, thousands transported as slaves to the Caribbean. For the Empire, Ireland was a battlefield to be pacified. For the Irish, it was a graveyard of martyrs. By the 18th century, Ireland was locked into a system of exploitation. The best land remained in the hands of Protestant landlords, many of whom lived in England, drawing rents from tenants they never saw. Irish farmers scraped survival from small plots, growing potatoes to feed their families while exporting grain, cattle, and butter to Britain. Ireland was rich in resources, but its wealth flowed outward, leaving its people hungry. The tension snapped in 1798. Inspired by the American and French revolutions, the United Irishmen rose in rebellion, calling for independence, unity, and equality. Catholics and Protestants fought side by side against British rule, but the rebellion was crushed with ruthless force. Villages burned, rebels executed, fields drenched in blood. The dream of liberty survived, but the cost was staggering. In 1801, Britain tightened its grip further with the Act of Union, binding Ireland directly to the United Kingdom. Irish voices were promised representation in Westminster, but in reality, their power was negligible. Decisions about Ireland's future were made in London, often by men who had never set foot on its soil. The Union was not partnership, but domination, cementing Ireland as a colony in all but name. The greatest tragedy came in the 1840s, the Great Famine. A blight struck the potato, the staple food of the poor. Crops rotted in the fields, and hunger spread like wildfire. But famine in Ireland was not simply a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe. As millions starved, ships laden with grain and livestock continued to sail from Irish ports to feed England. Ireland had food, but it was taken away by empire. Starvation hollowed the land. Families collapsed in cottages. Corpses lay by roadsides. Villages emptied. Fever and disease swept through the weak. Parents watched children waste away, powerless to help. Relief from Britain was slow, meager, and often tied to conditions designed to break Irish dignity. Workhouses became prisons of despair, where families were torn apart in exchange for scraps of food. The numbers defy belief. Over 1 million died between 1845 and 1852. Another 1 million fled, packed onto coffin ships bound for America and beyond. Entire communities vanished, leaving only empty fields and silent ruins. Ireland's population never recovered, shrinking by half over the following decades. The famine was not just hunger, it was cultural annihilation, a wound carved deep into Ireland's memory. The Empire called it misfortune. The Irish called it genocide. The question burned in every survivor's heart. Why did Britain allow its neighbor to starve while food left the island in abundance? The answer was cold: profit, prejudice, and the belief that the Irish were expendable. In Britain's eyes, famine was not a tragedy to prevent, but an opportunity to reshape Ireland, clearing the land for new landlords and investments. Even in the depths of famine, resistance stirred. Secret societies like the Ribbonmen and agrarian rebels struck back against landlords. The seeds of nationalist movements grew, watered by blood and suffering. The famine had proven one truth: Ireland's survival could never depend on empire. Freedom was the only path left. The late 19th century brought renewed struggles. Leaders like Charles Stewart Parnell demanded home rule, the right for Ireland to govern itself. Mass movements challenged landlords. Boycotts spread, and the Irish question dominated British politics. Each concession was delayed, watered down, or blocked. The empire could not imagine letting go of its first colony. Even as the world changed around it, tensions boiled over in 1916 with the Easter Rising. In Dublin, Rebels seized buildings, declared a republic, and fought against overwhelming odds. The rebellion was crushed within days, but the executions of its leaders turned them into martyrs. The empire had won the battle, but lost the narrative. Ireland's call for independence was now unstoppable. By 1919, Ireland erupted into the War of Independence. Guerrilla fighters of the IRA waged ambushes and sabotage against British forces. In response, Britain unleashed the Black and Tans, paramilitary units infamous for their brutality. Villages were burned, civilians massacred. Terror spread across the countryside. Ireland became a land of fire and fear, its people caught between empire and rebellion. The war ended in 1921 with a treaty. The Irish Free State was born, but partition divided the island. The North, with its Protestant majority, remained under British rule. Partition carved a wound that never healed, setting the stage for decades of conflict. For the South, independence was partial victory. For the North, empire's grip endured, but Ireland did not forget. The struggle continued in Northern Ireland, where discrimination against Catholics fueled decades of unrest. By the late 20th century, the Troubles exploded: bombings, assassinations, and battles in the streets. Britain deployed soldiers, but peace remained elusive. The legacy of centuries of empire echoed in every shot fired, every life lost. Even today, the shadow of empire lingers in Ireland. Borders, politics, identity, all shaped by Britain's centuries of domination. The famine is remembered not just as tragedy, but as betrayal. Independence is celebrated, but scars remain visible, etched into songs, stories, and the collective soul of a nation that endured centuries of fire. Ireland's story reveals a truth the empire tried to hide. Colonization was not confined to distant lands. It began at home, with a neighbor across the sea. The methods of conquest, exploitation, and suppression tested in Ireland were later exported across the globe to India, Africa, the Caribbean. Ireland was the empire's laboratory of domination, and yet, as Britain's grip on Ireland loosened, its empire elsewhere began to unravel. The 20th century was not the century of empire, it was the century of its collapse. Independence movements surged across Asia and Africa, fueled by the same hunger for freedom that burned in Ireland. And in India, the jewel of the empire, the fight would become an earthquake that shattered Britain's illusion of eternal power. The jewel cracks India, vast, ancient, and immeasurably rich. A land of kingdoms, languages, and faiths stretching back thousands of years. To the British Empire, it was not just another colony. It was the jewel in the crown. Control of India meant wealth, power, and prestige unlike anything else. But jewels are fragile, and in Britain's desperate attempt to hold onto India, it sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Britain's conquest of India was not a single event, but a slow tightening of chains. Beginning with the East India Company in the 1600s, merchants became rulers, armies replaced traders, and treaties turned into shackles. By the 19th century, Britain had reduced India from a tapestry of empires to a possession. The Mughal emperor became a figurehead, while real power lay in the hands of British officials and soldiers. India's wealth was drained systematically. Cotton, silk, spices, opium, and tea flowed to Britain, while Indian industries were crushed. Skilled weavers starved as British textiles flooded the market. Farmers were forced to grow cash crops instead of food, creating cycles of famine. The empire presented itself as a bringer of civilization. But what it truly brought was economic devastation. Resistance was inevitable. In 1857, it erupted in the First War of Independence, known to Britain as the Sepoy Mutiny. Indian soldiers rose against their British officers, angered by cultural insults and endless exploitation. From Delhi to Kanpur, rebellion swept the land. Britain responded with ferocity. Villages burned, civilians massacred, rebels executed by cannon fire. The uprising was crushed, but it shook the empire to its core. After 1857, the British Crown took direct control. Queen Victoria proclaimed herself Empress of India in 1876. Railways were built, cities modernized, and English education expanded. To Britain, these were symbols of progress. To Indians, they were tools of control. Railways moved troops, schools produced clerks for empire, and cities were reshaped to serve colonial elites. Modernization was not for India's benefit. It was for Britain's convenience. Famines became a recurring nightmare. In the late 19th century, millions died as drought struck, and the empire exported grain abroad. Relief was minimal, and policies rigid. Officials argued against handouts, fearing they would encourage laziness. Starving families watched trains carry food out of their country, while they withered in the dust. For India, famine was not just natural disaster. It was empire-made catastrophe. Yet the empire could not silence Indian voices forever. By the late 19th century, political movements emerged. The Indian National Congress, formed in 1885, began cautiously, seeking reforms and representation. But beneath its petitions lay a growing fire. India was awakening, and its people were no longer willing to be subjects in their own land. The 20th century brought new leaders, fiery, unyielding, and determined. Bal Gangadhar Tilak declared, "Swaraj is my birthright." Annie Besant rallied for home rule. And most famously, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi emerged, wielding a weapon the empire had never faced before: non-violent resistance. Gandhi turned salt, cloth, and simple marches into acts of defiance that shook the world. The Salt March of 1930 was more than protest. It was theater, strategy, and revolution combined. Gandhi walked hundreds of miles to make salt from the sea, breaking Britain's monopoly. Millions followed his example. The empire arrested him, but it could not arrest an idea. Salt, the simplest of substances, had become a symbol of freedom. Britain responded with repression. Protesters were beaten in the streets, leaders imprisoned, newspapers censored. Yet every act of violence only fueled the cause. The world was watching, and India's struggle became a global stage where empire's brutality was laid bare. The jewel in the crown began to glitter with cracks. World War II accelerated the unraveling. Britain demanded India's support, but Indian leaders refused unconditional loyalty. The Quit India movement of 1942 called for immediate independence. The empire cracked down once more, imprisoning thousands, even Gandhi himself. But the war had weakened Britain, its coffers drained, its armies stretched thin. The empire that once ruled the seas now struggled to stay afloat. At the same time, new forces pulled India apart. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanded a separate nation for Muslims. Communal tensions deepened as Britain played its old game of divide and rule. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, once united against empire, now looked at one another with suspicion. The empire's greatest trick was working one last time. By 1947, Britain could no longer hold India. The empire that had once boasted it would rule forever was now retreating in haste. Independence was inevitable, but it came with a price: partition. India would be divided into two nations, India and Pakistan. Britain presented this as a solution. In truth, it was an exit strategy, rushed and careless, leaving chaos in its wake. Partition unleashed horror. Communities that had lived side by side for centuries turned on each other in a frenzy of violence. Trains arrived at stations filled not with passengers, but with corpses. Villages burned, rivers ran red, millions fled their homes in terror. Up to 1 million people were killed, and millions more displaced. Independence came drenched in blood. For Britain, the retreat was framed as generosity, a gift of freedom. But for India and Pakistan, it was a scar that still bleeds. Partition was not liberation. It was the empire's final act of cruelty, leaving behind borders drawn in haste, families torn apart, and wounds that echo into the present. And yet, despite the horror, independence was real. The tricolor flag rose above Delhi. Pakistan claimed its sovereignty, and the British Raj, the crown jewel, was gone. The empire had lost its most prized possession, and with it, the illusion of invincibility shattered. Britain's global empire was collapsing. In the years that followed, colonies across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean broke free. The tide of independence, once unimaginable, swept the globe. Britain retreated, sometimes peacefully, often violently, always reluctantly. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of humanity crumbled within decades, but the story did not end there. The empire left behind scars, borders drawn without care, economies built for extraction, divisions exploited for centuries. These legacies haunt the modern world, fueling conflicts, poverty, and injustice long after the Union Jack was lowered. The empire fell, but its shadows remain. And Britain? It told itself a different story. In textbooks, empire became a tale of railways and law, of progress and civilization. The massacres, famines, and chains were hidden in footnotes, if mentioned at all. Generations grew up believing empire had been a force for good. The truth, the dark, bloody truth, was buried beneath myth. But history cannot be buried forever. The dark truths of empire rise again in songs, stories, and struggles for justice. They demand to be remembered, not as distant shadows, but as living forces that shaped the world we know. The British Empire may be gone, but its ghosts remain, whispering of famine, chains, diamonds, and blood. And until those whispers are heard, the story is not over.